Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Well, the days are happy, and they came back, so I guess happy days are here again. And this is Half the Answer, where understanding a question is half the answer. I am one of your hosts, Caitlin Green, linguist, writer, editor, mom, fall enjoyer. It's coming, guys. And with
costume designer.
Oh, I'm so excited. I'm trying to get the girls. Okay, see, I haven't even finished the intro, and you've already gotten me off track. I'm trying to get the girls on board for the two of them and their dad and me to be ABBA because they really like ABBA, and I just think it would be really fun. And I want to wear a beard. I really want to have a fake beard. I think that would be fun. Anyway, Trent is my co-host. My co-host is Trent Nelson. And he's a historian, a philosopher, a editor and writer with Liberal Currents, and also other places as well. He just gave us a little flash of the cool feather on the side of his hat, and it's really beautiful. Always impeccably dressed. Trent, how are you today?
I'm doing really well, Caitlin. Thank you so much. You know, we've gotten to have so many wonderful chats with people that we admire, who have given us such wonderful insight into such things as race science and Jeffrey Epstein and all sorts of terrible things as well as interesting things. Well, today I am fortunate enough to say that I have a hero of mine with us. He is a writer, but he is so much more than a writer. His name is Adam Hochschild, and he's written several books that you know, I promise that, whether it be King Leopold's Ghost, whether it be, the book that we will be referencing a lot here, American Midnight, which came out just a few years ago. He's done that and so much more. Good morning, sir. How are you today?
Good to be with you, Trent.
Well, the pleasure is absolutely all ours, sir. Again, thank you for finding some time to chat with us, and thanks for all of the great work that you've done. Although I suspect that my biography is paltry, would you give us your own biography before we begin talking about your work vis-a-vis the current situation in America and the world?
Well, my biography, to make it short, is just that I'm a writer who likes to write about what interests me. And what interests me are usually times and places where people are fighting for a better world, for social justice in one way or another. Sometimes I've been able to be on the scene as a journalist and have written magazine pieces. Most recent was about a remarkable program in a California state prison that reduced the state's normal 45% recidivism rate for people who graduated from this program to less than 2%. That piece was published in Mother Jones magazine earlier this year. Sometimes the things that interest me take me far back into the past. Wrote a book about the history of the anti-slavery movement in the British Empire, for example. A remarkable group of people who invented every political tool we use today. The political poster, the logo, the idea of a national organization with local chapters. They didn't invent the podcast, though. So anyway, I could go on, but those are the kinds of subjects that attract me.
Right. Bury the Chains is the book that he was just referencing, of course, and Spain in Our Hearts. That is another really, really thoughtful piece, a thoughtful book that you gave us. Spanish Civil War, we'll bring you back on to talk about that another time.
Absolutely.
Because it certainly is, I believe, relevant today. FDR said it was his biggest regret. But, sir, again, thank you for joining us. But your book, American Midnight, I was rereading it the other day, and it came out in 2022. Really, really powerful book written in the aftermath, of course, of the 45th president's term in office. He's now the 47th president. first of all, let's get into American Midnight, and then we'll sort of branch out from there as it concerns the similarities that we're seeing today in what I sort of refer to as a second midnight, and that particular one.
Okay, well, this period that I wrote about in American Midnight, and as a writer, it warms my heart whenever I hear somebody say, I reread your book,
Yeah.
what we always hope for. This was a period that has long fascinated me, roughly 1917 to 1921, Woodrow Wilson's second term as president. And a lot of things happened then that simply get largely left out of the average high school American history textbook. We learn about the First World War, the doughboys, in their forest ranger hats, going off to fight the war in Europe, helping to win it, coming back home. Then you turn the page and boom, it's the Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, the rise of Babe Ruth, and all of that. Well, there's a crack in between there where a lot of terrible things happened. Basically, they were ignited by two things. When the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, and remember, we were not attacked. We chose to enter this war. This was the largest war the world had ever seen. It had caused, already 5-6 million deaths in Europe. There is something about entering a major war that makes a country go half crazy. There was tremendous enthusiasm for this war. Then that was followed about 6 months later by the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks, the most militant faction, took power in Russia, and many people in the American establishment were terrified that the revolution would spread to the United States. The combination of the paranoia about the revolution and the patriotic hysteria kicked off by the war led to a number of highly repressive things, which, as I say, get left out of the standard high school history textbook. For example, during those 4 years, roughly 1,000 Americans spent a year or more in prison, and a much larger number, shorter periods of time in prison, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody did anything violent during that period. Plenty of people in prison for violent crimes, but these are political prisoners imprisoned solely for things that they wrote or said. The most famous of them was Eugene Debs, longtime socialist candidate for president. He'd won 6% of the popular vote in 1912. He was sentenced to a 10-year term solely for speaking out against the United States entering the First World War. Another thing that happened was the government sponsored a nationwide vigilante organization, something called the American Protective League, 250,000 members, chartered by the Justice Department, and they went around roughing up, seizing, doing citizens' arrests of young men that they thought were evading the draft. Usually only about 1% of the people that they took in, turned out to be actually evading the draft, but some of these guys had to spend, several days and nights cooped up in warehouses. They didn't have enough prison cells to hold them all. That was another form of terror. So these were some of the things that went on during this extremely repressive period. A third thing I should mention is press censorship on a huge scale. Within weeks after entering the war, the government passed the Espionage Act, a law which actually in its much amended form is still in effect today. Ironically, it was what Donald Trump was charged under for taking those classified documents to Mar-a-Lago. It gave the government the power to essentially shut down newspapers and magazines it didn't like. And some 75 such publications were shut down. So that's the scope of the repression during that period. And it's something that we all ought to pay much more attention to because there aspects of it, as you said, Trent, that are coming back today.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons I think that I personally was attracted to this book is that for those LC listeners who enjoy book lists, one of my books was Political Hysteria in America by Murray B. Levin, 1972, where Professor Levin actually talks about this same exact time period. He doesn't go into a lot of the different things, but he goes into the Bolshevik scare, the Red Scare, the first Red Scare. And so he uses that as sort of a mirror for us to look into. And certainly this book, American Midnight, it's right there in terms of something that you should be taking in as well. Now, you begin the book, sir, by speaking about a very particular moment. An anecdote in which involves the police and also some wobblies. What is a wobbly?
Okay.
And what did the police do to these folks? And why am I bringing it up today? I guess we'll get there, sir. Can you tell us the story?
Yeah. Well, the Wobblies, which was the name that everybody used for the country's most militant labor union, the Industrial Workers of the World, this was a nationwide union. As I say, the most militant. They had a principled position actually against signing contracts with employers, which, if you ask me, is not a very effective way to run a union. But nonetheless, they inspired a number of major strikes, and they certainly inspired tremendous hostility on the part of the establishment. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a wobbly office, and one evening in 1917, there were a dozen or so wobblies in there, mostly reading or playing cards. These wobbly offices, incidentally, sort of doubled as libraries. They had a good selection of books and magazines. People read a lot more in those days than they do today. They weren't looking at their little screens all the time. Anyway, the police barged in, arrested a dozen or so of these guys, held them for several days, couldn't think of anything to charge them with except vagrancy. And then after 3 days, these people thought they were going to be released from jail. Instead, they were seized by a mob of vigilantes, taken to the outskirts of town, stripped to the waist, beaten, whipped, and then tarred and feathered. And this was a very cold night out on the prairie, and they were told to run, get out of there, and shots were fired over their heads as that happened. Many of them got hurt, sort of scrambling over a barbed wire fence to get away. And I just use that episode as an example of the kind of vigilante terrorism that was unfortunately all too common during this period.
You know, I made a big face because I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So
Really?
I always, yeah. So I always am astonished by the things that they did not teach us about the place that I am from, right? So when I learned about Black Wall Street and the
Yes.
Tulsa massacre, and then this is another one. Here's another chapter from our local history that nobody ever told me about.
Well, actually, the man who was the judge who sentenced these wobblies for the crime of vagrancy, which meant they were just sitting in their office reading, playing cards. 4 years later, when the great massacre in Tulsa took place, when so many black people were killed, he was mayor of the town at that time.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's really interesting how these sort of anti-communist, anti-Russia panics and anti-blackness live together in the same hearts.
Yeah, always, and sir, political kidnappings, right? Like we kind of just went into with your story. Oh, well, they were not uncommon across this period. Another story you tell, of course, when we're talking about Kate Richards O'Hare, and all this trouble that she went through across her life. She ended up getting kidnapped, as you tell, right at the end of her life, driven out 125 miles or so out of town, and then, allowed to escape, perhaps.
That's right.
Um, but again, well, let's get into a little bit of that. You talked about male censorship, something that this current government would be happy to take part in if they felt they could get away with it. Methinks, um, but also labor repression as well. Of course, you just brought up there, but also an increased sort of desire to oppress certain groups and peoples. Can you talk to us a bit about that in the midst of war, but also, of course, in the midst of the Wilson administration, his administration famously known not as the kindest towards Black
Mhm.
people? He didn't even really support women's suffrage either. It was his daughters
Right.
who were big into that.
Finally brought him around on that score. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the other things you mentioned, there are a number of dark threads that run through American history. One of them, of course, is tremendous racism towards Black people, which we see surfacing in many different ways at different times. And of course, there's a lot of it still today. During this period, it was very much reflected in the Wilson White House. Wilson was a Southerner. He'd been born in Virginia. He'd grown up partly in Georgia. In his early writings, before he became president, he once said that he thought extending the franchise to everybody, the right to vote to everybody, was a terrible mistake. He idolized the Confederacy. His father, who was a minister, was actually a chaplain to Confederate troops. Um, and Wilson was as a child, actually was there at the end of the Civil War to see the defeated troops of the Confederacy file through the city in Georgia where he was living. When he was president, he went to the home of Robert E. Lee to sort of pay homage there. And the federal government was not very integrated to begin with, but it became even more segregated under Wilson. Uh, Somebody who was particularly segregation minded, for example, was his postmaster general, a man named Albert Burleson from Texas, had been a Texas congressman. Burleson's family owned 20 slaves at the time that he was born. And in the post office, he erected cloth screens and other barriers so that white workers would not have to look at Black workers when they were working. Burleson, as it happened, was in charge of the censorship operation because the Espionage Act, which I mentioned earlier, which gave the government the power to do this, did so by investing the Postmaster General, which Burleson was, with the power to deny mailing privileges, deny the use of the U.S. mail to any publication which he thought subversive.
Right.
Now, when you put that kind of power in the hands of one person, it's a tremendously dangerous thing. It disregards the First Amendment.
Right.
It's a truly horrible act. Burleson immediately went to work. He loved being chief censor. And as I mentioned, he used that power to shut down some 75 newspapers and magazines. Interestingly, the very first that he shut down was a small newspaper called The Rebel, a socialist newspaper in Hallettsville, Texas, which he had a grudge against because they had published some exposés about how he used prison labor on some farmland that he owned. And then he went to town, shutting down many, many other newspapers after that.
What a story, and one that we feel to varying degrees as though we are living through once again.
Mhm.
While we don't have, to our knowledge yet, male censorship, what we do have is something that seems eerily similar to what you mentioned before, sir. A group of militia going around the community, taking people that perhaps, as you noted, haven't done anything wrong other than try to live. And perhaps we could talk a bit about the American Protective League, and of course there are a lot of similarities between that and what we're seeing with ICE currently, being utilized as essentially brown shirts to varying
Mhm.
degrees. What can you tell us about the ghosts of our past, sir?
Okay. Well, another one of those dark threads that run through American history. In fact, we should mention two more because they sort of intertwine. One is the spirit of vigilante justice, which was there on the frontier, which was a very lawless place. And people who were the victims of that lawlessness were often Native Americans. And that's a spirit that we saw when, the January 6th invasion of the Capitol a few years ago. And that spirit is very much alive and well and with us today. The other thing I would point to is the thread of nativism that runs through American history, where the usual pattern is that people whose ancestors came here 2 or 3 generations ago uh, feel that those who came more recently and from some other part of the world uh, are not really Americans and shouldn't be here. And today we see that in the tremendous feeling directed against people coming mainly over the southern border of the U.S., largely but not entirely from Latin America. Uh, a century ago, there was not much immigration from Latin America, but there was a huge amount of immigration from Europe. However, the people in the first category, the people whose ancestors had come a couple of generations ago, were almost entirely from northwestern Europe, British Isles, Germany, Holland, Scandinavia, and so forth. The people who formed the bulk of the big immigration to this country that started around 1880 were from southern and eastern Europe, primarily uh, Poles, Jews, and Italians. And they were the ones who were accused of being, anarchists, communists, un-Americans, and let's stop them coming in. And there was tremendous fervor for deporting people. In the presidential elections of 1920, several of the major candidates for both the Republican and Democratic nominations for president campaigned on promises of mass deportations. One of those, who was up to the last minute the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was Woodrow Wilson's attorney general, uh, actually started deporting people, knowing that this would help his push for the presidency, in what came to be called the Palmer raids, where he would send Justice Department agents into communities of these recent immigrants all around the country, seize them, and try to find people who were not American citizens. He was looking for people who were active in radical politics, communists, socialists, anarchists, or whatever, who were not American citizens, and then deport them. Now, there were a lot of people who were not American citizens because they had come here at a time when the United States was welcoming immigrants, and they just never bothered to go through the formal apparatus of getting yourself certified as a citizen. It wasn't, usually wasn't required for a particular job. Um, Plus, some folks had never learned English that well, or just simply not bothered about it. So there were millions of people who were non-citizens. Palmer was looking for radicals who were non-citizens to deport. And his Justice Department agents seized about 10,000 of these people. He started deporting them. And then a very interesting thing happened. There was a very brave guy inside the government. Shall I sort of tell the story of what happened there?
Absolutely. Shout out to Lewis Post.
Okay.
Yeah, we need some inspiration here.
Okay. Uh, Lewis Post was a former journalist who was the number 3 ranking person in the Labor Department. And through a fluke, he became acting Secretary of Labor because the number 2 person had just resigned to run for Congress. The Secretary of Labor was on sick leave. And so Lewis Post found himself acting Secretary of Labor. He was very much a progressive in politics. He'd been a journalist. He had great respect for the First Amendment. And he was horrified that Palmer was arresting and starting to deport all these people seized in the Palmer raids. Now, there was a legal catch here, which was that Palmer, the Attorney General, had the power to arrest people, which the Attorney General still has today, of course, but deportations fell under the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Department of Labor. Palmer was not only a former journalist, he was a very well-trained lawyer, and he found means of stopping most of these deportations, claimed people had been arrested without valid arrest warrants, again, something that happens still today, and that there were other improprieties, and he invalidated a lot of the arrests, let thousands of people out of jail, infuriated Palmer, and infuriated the very young 25-year-old Justice Department official who was the real architect of the Palmer raids, a young man named J. Edgar Hoover, who would become much more notorious as time went on. Hoover was enraged that Post stopped this operation. He tried to get he got the American Legion to call for Post to be fired. He prepared a dossier against Post, got a congressional committee to investigate Post. Post was a superb performer on the witness stand, charmed this congressional committee. He was not deposed, and he remained in office until the last day of the Wilson administration, one of the relatively few really good people in top posts in that regime. So it was an example of a person with integrity who was part of the deep state, what Trump would call the deep state, who acted and saved thousands of people from being deported from the United States.
And that's why we needed to hear that story, sir, because as
Yeah,
Caitlin
honestly.
said, we need a little bit of positive reinforcement during this time. Of course, A. Mitchell Palmer, as I noted before, he is one of the main characters in Political Hysteria in America by Murray Levin. He's also one of the main characters in American Midnight by our guest Adam Hochschild. Really worth getting to know the Fighting Quaker or the Quaking Fighter or whatever you'd like to call him. He had many nicknames from his peers, to be sure. But he was not the only person who held many grudges against the people. Of course, he might have a better reason than many. They tried to blow him up at some point. That's an interesting story you tell, actually. But well, something that struck me as I was rereading it again was, of course, you brought up Albert Johnson, the lovely historical senator who is not lovely. You should know that I don't like him, but he is really worth getting to know right now because you mentioned the hubbub regarding immigration, just as we continue to have today. And he passed some legislation in 1924 that you bring up in the book. And well, I think we should talk about it here today because it's repealing several decades later is actually still very much in the public discussion today. Much of the far right laments about a change in the immigration laws that dates back to, I believe, 1964 1924, and it's when the Immigration Act of 1924, sponsored by Albert Johnson, is repealed. Can you give us a bit of background as to him and as to that and what that did, and obviously why we're all talking about it still?
Well, let's think of Albert Johnson as the Stephen Miller of his day. Both of these men had just a tremendous inner animus against immigrants. In Miller's case, it seems to be pretty wide-ranging, almost anybody, but perhaps particularly, the wave of people who've been coming from Latin America. In Johnson's case, Johnson was a member of Congress from Washington State, representative from a coastal district in Washington State. From very early on, before he went into politics, he was enraged at the number of Japanese immigrants that were coming into Washington State. The Yellow Peril. And in a small town newspaper that he ran, he would publish a count of the number of Japanese immigrants on each ship coming in. He carried that anti-immigration fervor into his time in the House of Representatives, and I think saw in it, as did so many politicians of that era and today, that there was tremendous possibility for demagogic appeal in riding this issue of saying all the problems we have are the fault of immigrants. And it's very parallel to what happens today, where Stephen Miller is the guy in the White House who's driving that rage against immigrants. Johnson was the person in Congress at that time, 100 years ago, who was driving it there. And it culminated in what you mentioned, Trent, the Immigration Act of 1924, actually the Johnson-Reed Act, as it's called, which is a very peculiar bill. It basically slammed the door on immigration to the United States for the next 41 years. But it was peculiarly structured. There was a small quota of people from every country who were allowed in. But that quota was based on the percentage of that particular ethnic group in the population. However, it was not based on the percentage of that ethnic group in the population by the most recent census, which would have been 1920, most recent before 1924, but rather the population of the United States as it was in 1890, before it reflected this big wave of Jews, Poles, and Italians and other Eastern Europeans coming in. So that meant that there was a very, very low quota for people, particularly from everywhere except, England, the Low Countries, Germany, so on, Northwestern Europe, from where there has not been much immigration in recent years anyway. But it basically slammed the door on immigration. This was the law that kept hundreds of thousands, perhaps potentially millions of Holocaust refugees out of the United States. We were not the only country to slam such a door. Many, many, many other countries did. But I've often thought that if that law had not existed, or if it had been suspended to let in all the refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe who would have liked to come here, rather than stay there and be destined for the death camps, it would have not only saved potentially millions of lives, but I wonder if today's Middle East would be different, because if millions of Jewish refugees had been able to come to the U.S. then, there might not have been such a big rush to immigrate to Israel before and after World War II. Had there been a smaller number of Jewish immigrants there, perhaps the two peoples, Jews and Arabs, who had long both existed in that part of the world, might have had an easier time sharing things than they have had today, to put it mildly.
That's right. Shout out to our episode on far-right perspectives of Israel, when we described kind of the evolution of Christian Zionism and the way that it interacted with this Immigration Act, so that, there's this this sense of like, we have to do something for the persecuted Jewish people of Europe, it's not going to be having them come over here. No. We have to come up with something else.
Good. I'm
Right.
glad you're covering that, Caitlin.
Right, exactly. We feel very badly for the Jews, except that we don't want them
But
in
please
Europe.
don't invite them over.
Don't
Oh my
want them
gosh.
in America.
Yeah.
Don't know what we're gonna do, sir. But again, thank you for that history. Moving forward, however, it gets repealed in 1965, and since then, well, we've had many wonderful folks come to our country, and gratefully so, rightfully so. Um, but today, you actually hear a lot of lament from the right, from the Republicans, that this law
Oh man.
was overturned.
I would love to see Albert Johnson just like stroll through the campus of the University of Washington right now, and he would just have an actual heart attack.
Yes.
That's where I did my undergrad, was at University of Washington. So I'm just like thinking back. I used to go into the English as a foreign language classes as a conversation partner for students that were international students. It was such a good time. And I would always come in with like a handful of idioms I wanted them to learn, because they find it very funny, because learning an idiom in another language is hilarious.
Sure.
They were always like, "What do you have today, Caitlin? What is it?" It was very fun. They'd be in these classes and their textbooks were like so old, right? So they'd learn things like, it's raining cats and dogs. And they'd be like, Caitlin, do people say that? And I'd be like, never in my life have I actually heard a person, honestly say it's raining cats and dogs. So I would bring them stuff like, oh, you could, if there's a lot of something, you could say there's a boatload of it. And if you're feeling rude, you could say it's a buttload. And they would go, ha ha ha. Just stuff that people actually would say in, 2008 when I was there.
Yeah. Raining cats and dogs doesn't make sense because we don't have roofs the same way that we used to. But when we used to have roofs that were like thatched with like grains and grasses and stuff, raining cats and dogs was an unfortunate byproduct of bad weather sometimes.
You just have to make sure you don't step in a poodle.
Yes. Well, we can talk about idioms all day. I also know why you need a pot to piss in, but we should continue onward.
Right.
So, sir, we have vigilantism, in which groups are going out into the street, going out into the communities, and looking to find people that maybe match a certain conception.
And of course, here in the Pacific Northwest, we've never struggled with that, vigilantes or gangs or, militant groups. That's, I've never had to worry about that walking down the street.
Correct. The great Northwest is renowned for its civility in that respect. We also have immigration. We also have troubles with immigration. We also have a government which seems hell-bent on restricting certain civil liberties. Sir, how did we get back into 1918? And what would you say are some helpful tools, helpful things to keep in mind as we sort of sit in this position, trying to get ourselves out, only approximately 8 months into a 4-year term? What do you have for us as it concerns that, sir?
Well, I think there are some differences between what we're going through now and what the United States went through just over 100 years ago. And there's some of those differences which, in a subtle way, I think we can take encouragement from. We could not have had this discussion openly. Podcasts existed at that time. Opposition, journalism of all kinds was rudely repressed. We described how the Postmaster General censored these newspapers. Newspapers and magazines. Print was the medium of that day. This was pre-radio, pre-television, pre-internet. Ironically, the office from which the Postmaster General carried out his censorship operations was the building that was then Post Office headquarters, which 100 years later became the Trump International Hotel. And during that era, you could actually stay in a set of rooms they called the Postmaster General Suite for $4,000 a night.
Oh my
So,
God.
so we have certainly attempts at censorship now, and Trump tries very vigorously, to put pressure on media every way he can. The Washington Post editorial page is moved to the right because Jeff Bezos doesn't want to lose government contracts.
Yeah.
Similar moves in the world of television.
Right.
But, there is a lot of opposition media. What you're doing, what 100 other podcasters are doing, what mainstream media that hasn't been cowed, like the New York Times, is doing. And you can find out what's happening in the world from the media in a pretty unvarnished way, which
Right.
was not always possible 100 years ago. I also think that despite the truly horrible Supreme Court we have right now, that Americans and the American judicial system has a greater respect for the First Amendment than they did 100 years ago. The Espionage Act that let the government pretty arbitrarily charge people, and sentence them to up to 20 years in prison for speaking out against the war that the U.S. was engaged in then, I don't think would be upheld by a majority, even of today's awful Supreme Court. That was also the act that let the press censorship go on. I think there is a sort of wider appreciation of civil liberties. We need to make use of that in every possible way to withstand the pressures that we're going to be under, because those pressures are there, they're going to get worse, and they're especially going to get worse as Trump's popularity drops, and that's why he's doing things like trying to get Republican states to gerrymander their congressional districts so as not to lose his majority in the House of Representatives. He will try all sorts of other measures like that. We have to be prepared for them. We have to resist them. There will be a blizzard of such attempts, and some of them will be struck down by judges. Others will get through. He will try new things. He will keep trying new things. And we just have to be prepared in every possible way.
I have a question
Yeah.
also. So a pattern that we've been seeing in the current era is a general sort of depriving and withholding of financial resources from institutions like schools, like the Postal Service, anything that he can figure out how to keep money away. And that's kind of designed to degrade and also maybe even privatize those areas. Is there a parallel to this like Wilson era that you've written about, or is that kind of a new tactic that we see?
That's a good question, Caitlin. I think it's pretty new. I don't see a parallel. I don't see a parallel even under some of the more really right-wing presidents we've had, like Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush. They didn't try to cut off all federal funding for universities. Yeah. They didn't appoint quacks to run the National Institutes of Health. Trump has gone much farther than anybody before him has done in those kinds of things, much farther.
So I have an elementary school age daughter, and we get these messages periodically that are like, so it turns out that a federal program that we were using for, let's say, like mental health, we got one of those that our mental health support is essentially gone now. We don't have the resources that we had because it was under a federal program, right? And a lot of my daughter's friends were using services, and my daughter too, because they had these like social emotional learning lessons that they were doing that like they now don't have the staff for.
Well, I think a interesting question facing us all is, what is going to be the impact of those cuts as they are felt, and they will be felt, I think, most harshly by Trump's base, by the people who voted for him,
Right.
by people who are poor, who are in rural areas, who are in red states, which, on almost without exception, get much more money from Washington in one way or another than they pay in taxes to Washington. Will
Yeah.
that be enough to change people's minds? Um, I wish I could say that, of course, people would say, oh my goodness, my kid
I'm
doesn't
being hurt by this policy.
Medicaid isn't covering what it used to. Uh, I can't get my immunization. I made a mistake in voting for him.
Right.
There will
I have
be.
the distinct honor of living in one of the only blue states that actually takes more than it gives. So, so we'll feel it too.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's a rare exception.
Yeah.
But will people, if people were fully rational, um, they would change their minds and there would be a groundswell of opposition. People are not fully rational.
Right.
That's the problem. And Trump will find ways of convincing people that, that cut in Medicaid that your grandmother just experienced, that's because immigrants were abusing the
Yep.
Medicaid program.
Easy. It's right there for them to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I would
Um,
I would use the language of John Maynard Keynes. The market can stay irrational for longer than you can stay solvent.
cool.
these
I love it.
these folks should well, I mean, they should come out and say, well, I made the mistake. But again, I think part of the reason why I don't suspect that they will is because a lot of this would end up falling back onto them. And they've invested so much into this belief that to turn around after 8, 9, 10 years and say, well, I made a big boo-boo, unless there is some, as you sort of both alluded to, some sort of major, I can't feed my family and there aren't even any turnips left. I don't think you get what you got in 1932.
And you especially don't get it when there is a charismatic figure. I mean, look at Hitler. From beginning of 1943 on, it was completely clear that Germany was destined to lose the war and to lose it horribly, and that Germany would be crushed. Was there a big uprising against him? No. People, you get caught up in something, you keep going. You don't want to feel, I made a mistake to give my loyalty to this guy. There were, of course, penalties if you turned against the regime. But, in Russia today, Putin's war against Ukraine has been a disaster for Russia. It isolated it still more already than it was in the world economically. 1 million Russians have been killed or injured in that war. An estimated other million Russians, including some of the, young and most talented people in the country, fled the country to avoid the draft. It's been a disaster, but there is no widespread anti-Putin movement that we can see any signs of there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, we like to talk about Nazis or Confederates or fascists. We like to speak about them as though they are all sort of Heinrich Himmlers, like they're all sort of these very obvious, what some might call an evil person. But I think more
Stephen Miller's.
often, right, I think there's more often what we actually see from the general public in these circumstances is that many of the Nazis, they just lack a certain amount of apathy. They don't necessarily agree even with the running of the regime, but they don't have the fortitude to stand up and say this is not right. There's a group that stands up and says this is not right. There's a group that is fully supportive, and then there's sort of this amorphous group that just like goes along with
Mhm.
the movements of the society. And I think there is a historical argument over like which group does this section belong to? Do they belong to the Nazis, or do they belong to like the people who were just sort of
Mhm.
victims of this in a
Right.
societal way? And I mean, I'd be interested. What would you say your thoughts are on that, sir? For all of the people who aren't really making a big fuss out of it, where do they sort of stand in the moral compass of history?
Well, I think there are an awful lot of people in this country who are good people in their personal lives who don't give a lot of thought to politics. And when they do give thought, they don't give it very rationally. I mean, I say that I happen to be right now as I mentioned, at the house where in the state of Maine, where my wife and I come to write each summer. Her family actually comes from here, and they used to farm the land that we're on. Um, it's an area that voted about 2/3 for Trump in the last several elections. Um, and they're good people. They're not fascists strutting around waving swastikas. They're people who are influenced by things he says, but they don't bother to fact check whether it's true or not. They're riled up about immigrants, even though there are relatively few immigrants in the town that we're in, and the
Yeah.
town is losing population and could probably use some immigrants to fill jobs that other people don't want to do. People can follow an evil person without being evil themselves.
Right,
And
right.
that's what I feel. I wish they would be a little more rational and ask questions
Think
and
through the implications.
yeah.
Thing. Yeah.
And there's signs on all sides of it. I mean, I was at the local medical clinic yesterday, and I saw a sign on the wall of the consulting room that said, "This is a federally funded clinic," which made me wonder. All right, is that clinic still going to be there next year? Is there funding
Yeah.
going to
Right.
dry up? When it dries up, who will people blame? Will they
Right.
blame Donald Trump, or will they say, "Oh, that damn clinic, you know, shut down because they didn't care about us
Yeah, they
enough"?
gave up on us, right?
Yeah,
Well, they won't blame themselves, sir. That much we're pretty much certain
yeah.
of. But again, I tend to agree with you in the sense
Mhm.
that you can go back in time and you can look at pictures of Italian fascists like on picnic in like the
Yeah.
northern Italian countryside, and you can see like Nazis, like, and they look, for all intents and purposes, like you and I, like normal
Mhm.
folks, like just like regular happy, like I'm happy to be here with my family. And I think that is a lesson that we need to sort of take with us, is that our actions do have consequences. And
Yeah.
even if we ourselves don't identify perhaps
Mhm.
with enacting these things, that our apathy can betray us still and
Yeah.
turn us into something that we do not see ourselves as.
Yeah.
I think incredibly, even though you and I, all three of us, are aware of the ways in which things are already very bad, there's
Mhm.
stories every day. But I think a lot of people are still basically able to live their lives feeling like they're untouched by it.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't feel real to them because it hasn't quite like hit them in that way.
Yeah.
Maybe even you could even be living in a city where some of the stuff is happening. It's not happening on your street. You're able to sort of not think about it.
And I think they structured some of these Medicaid cuts and so on so that it won't hit right away.
Mhm.
Right. Right. And that comes back to this whole discussion of, Musk and I'm sorry, Trump and his one-time friend Elon Musk, right? You heard reports suggesting that part of Musk's issue not only having to do with electric vehicles and whatnot, but also having to do with like the speed at which lots of programs are deconstructed. And I was struck at that point by the subtlety of the Trump logic, right? Like Musk is not a politician, even less than Trump, and he would just take it all down right away because that's the most efficient way to do it, right? But for Trump and the Republicans, they know that people are going to be mad as hell if they don't have a hospital within 70 miles of them, like next year. Like, that's not reasonable. How are we going to trick them properly unless we slow play it? Right? A little bit here, a little bit here. And then, like you said, sir, we can still always say, as you hear on the television, as you hear on the radio, right? When it's bad, we're living in Biden's economy. When it's good, we are living in the great regime of the president. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I was just looking at the Department of Homeland Security social media account because I was just thinking about, the way you talked about the political prisoners and the like accused draft dodgers that were being put in these really unsafe, crowded cells and things, and the way that we're doing that now with immigrants, right? And some of them are even citizens, or they have a valid visa, or, they were in the middle of a process that they were already being monitored by the legal system, and they get sort of scooped up. And then about 2 hours ago, there was a story about how some doctors tried to go in to 26 Federal Plaza to look at the conditions to see if they could judge the conditions and maybe do a press conference later to tell everybody how bad it is, right? They were prevented from accessing the facility. The Department of Homeland Security tweeted about it. Do we still call it tweeting? They X'd about it. I don't know, man. So they said random people, regardless of the profession they claim, cannot just show up unannounced to our ICE facilities and expect to be granted access. And so, they're basically they are preventing any kind of assessment of the quality and the standards that are in these facilities that they've packed people into.
Awful.
Well, we've got to get our Potemkin prison set up, sir. We can't have everyone coming in and seeing how we keep folks. And this is again one of my sensitive points. We lock people up, and for the broad population in so many ways, that sort of like allows for whatever to happen. So if the prison is like rusty and full of bugs and disgusting, like that's a part of the punishment in many people's minds, is that you get locked away and like you're in bad conditions. And if you don't want those bad conditions, then you shouldn't have gotten locked away. But as I always like to preach, and Caitlin knows this, right? It's like the punishment is to be locked away. It's to be taken out of society and
it's not all this other stuff that's dangerous to your body and your mind. Right. So back to this idea of like, what do regular people who are Trump supporters think? I know I am related to some people who would see this kind of thing, these conditions, and they would say serves them right? Yeah. Because it's about hurting the right people.
Yes.
And Trump has promised he will hurt the right people. Anytime they see somebody who's emaciated or who is sick because of the conditions they've been in, who's been injured, that is proof that he's doing a good job, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for his hardcore base, I think, the worse the conditions, the more they like it. But the rest of us really have to raise hell about those conditions because it reflects horribly on what we ought to stand for in this country.
Right. And these same people in 2020 were talking about like George Floyd and stuff and saying, well, he should have just followed instructions,
Right.
Same thing, serves him right.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, sir, since we're talking about people that are locked up, and we've touched upon political prisoners, and we've touched upon, of course, how we are not taking care of people in the modern world. Well, I know we have to let you go sooner than later, and we'd love to have you back on, talk more stuff if you can find the time, to be sure. But, well, we'd be remiss if I didn't get to another one of my favorites that you mentioned. Her name was Emma Goldman,
Mm-hmm.
and she was mistreated, just like Kate Richards O'Hare, just like so many thousands of people. Eugene V. Debs. Um, Her story is not the most pleasant at the end, because while we're all looking for a happy ending, for the protagonist or a protagonist to overcome the problems of the society, um, well, she was kicked out of the country.
That's
Um,
right. She had lived in the United States since the age of 16. She was, my memory fails me, but I think she was about 50 when she was arrested
exactly.
in 1917. She was sent to prison for 2 years, and then as soon as she got out of prison, they started deportation proceedings against her. And in 1919, she was put on a ship out of the country. She was never allowed to come back and live here. She was allowed to come back for a very short lecture tour under Franklin Roosevelt's administration. He was more tolerant about this kind of thing, but she was never able to come back and live in the country that, up to the age of 50, she'd lived in for the great majority of her life, where she'd found her voice as a writer, discovered who she was politically, um, and it was a great loss to the United States.
And we close on that because Emma Goldman was a great loss to the United States. And currently, we are in the process of potentially losing countless Emma Goldmans,
That's right.
countless brilliant thinkers, real patriots of humanity. And
Some of
it
them
is
to other countries, some of them to facilities.
right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, one thing that we got from today, I think, is whatever your skill set is, right? Whatever access you have, just to help the people who are most vulnerable that you
Absolutely.
can access, right? Like if you can feed people, stock up the food pantries near you. If you're a medical professional, advocate for your patients. If you have skills in the legal field, defend the people who are under attack.
And turn out for demonstrations. There will be many, many more. And the more people we get into the streets, the better.
I've got my posters on the floor here ready to go at a moment's
Good.
notice.
Well, keep it up, you guys. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
It's
so
been
much,
really
sir.
great.
Thank
Well,
you so much, sir.
this has been Half the Answer, where understanding a question is half the answer, or something like that. Trent, tell me, did I get it?
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.